Thank you, Daniel.
Thanks for the introduction. Well, thank you everybody for making time. And I know my presentation isn't showing at the moment. I've unshared. Just wanted to basically check in with you personally where I'm at right now, because I think it's always really important to ground all these conversations in lived reality. And I've spent the whole day thinking, how do I best serve with this conversation? And initially went down the path of trying to write a big Medium post on my Medium blog about this topic. And then last minute decided that maybe I should offer a presentation, because I reread an email that invited me to do so. And so I've just put a PowerPoint together that is based on some work that I've done recently with a regional council in England that was looking at bioregional development. And before we go into the topic of what the role of universities are in enabling bioregional regeneration, I think it might be useful to just briefly sketch out what I mean by bioregional regeneration. So let me just see if I get used to Google Hangout. Present now. Window screen 2. That will be it. Allow. Okay. Are you seeing anything now? No. Yeah, you can see the screen. Okay.
Yes. Yes.
Great. So first of all, what's a bioregion? One of the oldest definitions of a bioregion is that it's not just a geographical terrain, but it's also a terrain of consciousness. And when we talk about co-creating very diverse regenerative cultures that are carefully attuned to the biocultural uniqueness of place, we're basically talking about coming home to the bioregions that we not only inhabit, but that we're actually expressions of. And ultimately, I think the challenges of the next 3 decades could be summed up as we need to fundamentally redesign the human impact on Earth within the next 2 or 3 decades, from being exploitative and degenerative, from decreasing ecosystems health and planetary health, from eroding social cohesion and healthy societies, to being healing again, to being regenerative. And part of that is that we need to refit human civilization to the life-enhancing patterns of the planetary biosphere. The current globalized civilization does not have a fit with the way that scale-linking patterns in nature produce health at and across all scales, from a cell, an organ, an individual, a family, a community, an ecosystem, a bioregion, all the way up to the planet. And part of that, in this picture, you see these wonderful, illustration of the river systems of the Earth. That is a pattern that is a biophysical, biogeophysical reality of planet Earth, of how life as a planetary process fits onto this planet with a biosphere. When you call up in memory the maps that you're used to on a global map, the straight lines of nation states that are really a socio-political structure that has been created in an era of power over, of exploitation, of empire, and that is relatively recent and might in and of itself have been a detour of the human species away from our intimate relationship with place and a living planet. And so to me, when we're now looking at climate change, making it increasingly urgent to transform our systems, with when we're looking at the deep level of breakdown we're already observing everywhere, cascading ecosystems collapse, the rate of species extinction, then we need to remember that resilience isn't rigidly holding on to the status quo or after disruption bouncing back to it always. There are 2 aspects of resilience, which is the capacity to adapt or the capacity to persist, which speak to that part of resilience. But One.
Sorry, Daniel.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I can't see your slides properly. I think you need to do the full screen share because I'm getting thank you very much. Perfect.
Can you now see the whole slide? Yeah.
Lovely.
Okay, good. So we need to, thanks for letting me know. Now I can't see you guys anymore, but it's okay. So basically we need to somehow remember that the minute we have the human capacity for anticipation and foresight in the system, we can create a different type of resilience, which is transformative resilience, which is to fundamentally transform our economic and social systems in order to anticipate the changes that are already coming down at us. And we know that we can't continue with business as usual. So business, like the type 1 resilience of constantly, when there is a disruption like a climate change disaster or war or some form of like the pandemic that we're currently under, to simply bounce back to the old status quo is ultimately a path towards continued degeneration. To bounce forward to a new status quo that then increases our capacity to respond and evolve and be part of life as a planetary process, reintegrate with life's patterns of creating conditions to health. That would be, to my mind, the challenge of humanity in the next decades. And we can go back as we try to refit into those patterns. We can draw on 40 years of research in the Resilience Alliance and ecosystem science, where this image, in a somewhat abstract way, speaks to how transformative process and change processes constantly happen in nature at different scales. And that collapse and breakdown is part of deconstructing rigid patterns and rigid connections that no longer serve, in order to enable enough creativity through somewhat a chaotic state in the system, so reorganization, redesign, and something new can actually emerge. And in many ways, in this time where we're seeing breakdown on so many levels, at least understanding that these periodic patterns of breakdown are actually part of life's change processes might give us a little bit of support in these turbulent decades that are now coming at us. And what's also really important is that this dynamic, as we know from 40 years of studying ecosystem, happens in local patches, in somewhat larger places, and then in regional places and at the planetary scale. So it happens at different time scales and at different spatial scales, and they're all interconnected. And unfortunately, our universities have separated all the disciplines into silos, created a wealth of knowledge in each and every one of those silos. But so far, to my mind, a lot of the conversation about interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity is lip service, or even if it's well intended in projects, very often it runs into the bureaucracy and the rank and power of existing silos within universities. And so it never really becomes a truly transdisciplinary project. And we also know that there are lots of ways of re-regionalizing economic activity and creating solidarity and social cohesion through new ways of sharing that people have experimented with over the last 30, 40 years. And these methods are now quite mature. And so what I'm putting on the table today in this conversation is really what's the role of universities in all this? But before we go there, let me just give you an example of how this is really quite relevant, like in terms of that while the universities are not really waking up to this agenda yet, local authorities are beginning to realize that if they want to meet the demands that are now put on them under the pandemic, and with repeating floods and environmental disasters, with social cohesion problems and mental health problems and all that, they're beginning to realize that the regional approach might actually be a significant scale to pay attention to, that we've somehow underestimated. And the coming slides are from a presentation that I gave to Doncaster Regional Council to invite them into this bioregional way of thinking. And again, contextualizing it globally, if we want to increase planetary health, then we need to refit human processes, the way we meet human needs, to the biophysical reality of the regions that these humans inhabit. We've created a global system that has an enormous environmental and social external impact that is not included in economic analysis. We have these externalities of social and ecological damage that allow companies to make a profit while they're actually creating huge costs that then society has to pick up. And we're at the beginning of the UN decade for ecosystems restoration, and there's more and more research coming out of how we need to, in order to heal ecosystems, we need to focus on key areas that are critical for planetary health, but we really need to do it everywhere. And that means engaging people in place in social, cultural, economic activities that reconnect them to place. And to my mind, universities could have a central role in this. And some universities have woken up to this framing of planetary health. I wrote my PhD in 2006 on planetary health and design for human and planetary health. And at the time, nobody was really talking about this subject. But in the last 5 or 6 years, more and more initiatives, like the Planetary Health Commission was established by the Rockefeller Foundation and the Lancet to look into the link between ecosystems health, planetary health, and the health in human populations. This is pre-pandemic. And what they realized is that basically if we want to improve planetary health, we need to improve ecosystems health. And the only scale we can do that at is at the landscape level. And therefore, we need a regional ecosystem scale focus in order to look at how we match, as this slide shows, the key bits of meeting human needs to the unique conditions of each region. I won't go into this in much detail. It's just the framework of how we move from conventional to regenerative practice. I think most people have seen this. Also, historically, this is not something new. Patrick Geddes, over 100 years ago, said that city planning has to take place in a bioregional context, and also understood that if you want to engage culture change, you have to engage beyond the university, the general public, in understanding their place. So this slide shows the Outlook Tower, which is just outside of Edinburgh Castle. And it's basically a public museum where people could walk in and at the bottom floor have an exposition of the world as it was known at the time. Then they would walk up one floor and see Europe, and then the UK, and then Scotland, and then Edinburgh. And at the top floor, they had a camera obscura that allowed them to look at the whole city of Edinburgh, which at the time was quite blingy technology. But what if you think of what that short little walk through that museum did for people, is it allowed them to understand how their place was nested in a planetary system. And over the years, this bioregional approach has developed. There's a UK-based organization called Bioregional that has created these One Planet Living baselines, or that are based on living within the footprint of your own region. And GIS, the Global Information System mapping software, allows us now to map layers and layers of information onto a landscape. And this is not just ecological and hydrological and fauna and flora and infrastructure, but it can also be historical importance, the cultural networks, in order to really begin to understand place. And to my mind, that's where the universities have missed an opportunity, because there are now many organizations that are moving into that space from a non-academic position. So what I'm suggesting is that the bioregional scale is really the missing link, so to speak, in working locally, in healing the global system through local action. If you just focus on too small a local scale, you cannot create the synergies at a systemic level to meet human needs. But if you only work on a global scale, as my friend and mentor Bill Reed from Regenesis Institute once said really succinctly, you can't save the planet, but you can save places. The only minute, even when in the academic conversation around planetary health now, if we stay at the level of how do we design for planetary health, it will be theoretical. But if we look at it through the lens of how do we do that in this region, how do we heal social systems, ecological systems, and economic systems in this region and create cultural narratives for this region that are born out of this place that actually support people to live and building social and ecological foundations in place. And so in many ways, if again, for those of you who are familiar with regenerative thinking, this notion of the triad, that instead of having the two opposing forces between local and the national global scales that very often now are in conflict because of a perverse economic system, if we put serving the local and serving the global collaboration and planetary health in dynamic polarity in service to the bioregion, then we can unleash the potential of actually serving at all three levels. It requires a four-dimensional integration of social, ecological, economic, and worldview, or cultural and political issues in the place we live in order to support both people and place in a planetary context. And this is something that is beginning to happen in many places around the world. One example would be the Bioregional Learning Center in Devon that is doing wonderful work in this field. Here's some questions that I'll share the PDF later with the notes, but basically they're questions of how do we ground from a political and cultural sphere in a bioregion. And then in the economic domain, we now have the wonderful Donut Economic Action Lab helping people in their cities, in their places, to ground this one planet living in place. The recent report on creating city portraits, to my mind, could have been even more strengthened if it had contextualized cities within bioregions in a more explicit way. It's doing it, but as Geddes said over 100 years ago, if you like planning cities without the bioregional context makes it difficult to do a good job. But these core questions of what will it mean for people of this place to thrive? What would it mean for this place to respect the well-being of people worldwide? What would it mean for for this place to thrive within the natural habitat? And what would it mean for the city to respect the health of the whole planet? You can see it's a very akin approach to what I'm talking about with bioregional regeneration. And in the field of ecosystems restoration, there are many organizations, just naming Common Land and the Ecosystems Restoration Camp to name two of them, that are trying to create viable pathways to restoring ecosystems at the landscape level. And that's also a key part of this. But the universities are sleeping in all of this. There's very little support through and from universities in place. Again, more questions. Then also with regard to, we've just seen in the US election how disenfranchising rural population, because you only focus on the educated people in urban areas, can create dangerous rifts through the country, particularly when demagoguery comes in, like it has over the last 4 years. And that means that we need to heal the relationship between cities and their region. And Herbert Girardet and the World Future Council have done some work on regenerative cities. And it also concludes that in order to make our cities more regenerative, we have to close the loops at the regional scale. But this is not just about technical solutions. It's about making people fall in love with their place again and tell narratives about their city that create to create a flourishing of cultural expression that is born out of the bioculture uniqueness of a local place and a local culture. So this is another framework to think about this, but I won't go into so much detail on that. Also, some of the organizations that are already doing this, I'm not sure, Herbert Müller is probably on this call from the University of International Cooperation in Costa Rica, which is one of the few universities that really has put driving bioregional development at the center of their raison d'etre as a university. Okay, now very briefly, a couple of projects, how I've been playing around with this, and then I would really like to actually hear who's on this call, hear whether this is at all relevant to your situation, and particularly if there are people in academia, hear a kind of response. So a few years ago, just after I finished my book, Designing Regenerative Cultures, which was an early, well, I finished the writing of it in 2015, but it came out in 2016 in May. And in between, I was working with Gaia Education on a number of projects. And one of them was creating a new program that so far hasn't been implemented yet, but it was called Bioregional Design Education. And the idea was really to build on two programs that Gaia Education, which is a global provider of sustainability education through a design lens, but for lifelong learning, not just, I mean, they've worked with academia, but they're a lifelong learning institution, NGO. The first course that Gaia Education created was called Eco-Village Design Education. It was a 125-hour residential course, initially only taught in eco-villages, later also taught in big cities around the world. But it's full of participatory learning and experimentational techniques that engage people with each other, that spark this idea of becoming community, that make people really feel what it means to co-create in community for a healthier planet. And it's a little bit more of a song and a dance and practical hands-on work, because you're working in a face-to-face environment, ideally in an eco-village or a sustainable community. And then later they also created a more than 400 hours, very complex online course based on the same 4 dimensions: social, worldview, economic, and ecological, that is called Designing for Sustainability, or Design for Sustainability. And that course really gives the backbones to the initial introduction of the 125-hour course, but it already goes out of this focus on how do we create eco-village and sustainable communities, and has a lot of material on the importance of bioregionalism and re-regionalizing economics and ecosystems restoration and all that. And what I was working on, using the island that I live on and that I moved to because it is, as an island, a perfect case study for bioregional regeneration, Mallorca in the Mediterranean, I used this local island as my personal case study in developing this program. And the idea was that people would get taken through a year-long program as a cohort of 20-25 people, and have maybe one weekend a month of a face-to-face content where you would work through basically 125 hours of the face-to-face course, while in a blended learning way, in between those monthly sessions, be engaged in online learning, using the material already existing in the online course, but always being guided by local tutors very familiar with the local bioregion, to investigate, apply, question what they've learned in the course material with regard to application to the local region, and also investigate and build a knowledge base of the local region and the local networks, making social network mappings and mapping of sources of funding, mapping of educational institutions to collaborate with, all of that, in order to basically build the capacity of the people going through this one-year program to be change agents of bioregional regeneration in their place. The reason why this hasn't been implemented yet is simply that we're currently in a state, and the universities are victim of that too, that we think that education needs to wash its own face in terms of economic income. And this is where governance is failing, because how can the state not support education, which is the key building of capacity of its citizens to be adaptable in the future and create innovation and future prosperity for all. So we're in a bit of a how do we change the game if the playing field is rigged kind of situation, as is the whole conversation around how to create regenerative economics and regenerative enterprises. But that shouldn't stop us from trying to push that need for integrating the wealth of knowledge that universities have generated over the last 150 years of increasing specialization and taking deep dives into the silos of both the scientific and the social science disciplines and all the other disciplines. But we need to, the way to really work on transdisciplinarity and integration would be by taking what the big learnings in these fields are and applying them rigorously to the local region and engaging students in their learning of the wider field, always with application and significance of what they're learning to their local region. And so I've been playing around with this with the local university here on Mallorca, and helped to create a sort of spin-off center that sits, it's an innovation center that sits within the university, but is agile enough to engage local businesses and local community without being trapped in the bureaucracy of the local university. And it's called Smart UIB. Smart partially because it was born out of the artificial intelligence and computer science department, but I eventually, because I was somewhat annoyed that the one thing that we couldn't change was the name SMART, came up with this acronym: Sustainable, Multidisciplinary, or Multi-Sector, Applied, Regenerative, and Resilient, and Transformative. And then it takes SMART out of the box of just lots of sensors and computers crunching that big data with AI in order to come up with something. There might be applications for that too, but I think as single-minded focused on the technological solutions would be mistaken. And this center is now up and running. You can see a building there that was renovated. It was a ruin, an old farmhouse near the university parking lot, and now it's a one of the most highly performing eco retrofits in the country. That generates its own electricity and own heating and cooling from solar energy, and has a green roof and a straw bale building part, and all sorts of, it's packed full of sensors and collects its own data. And it's the beginning, it's at least a physical manifestation of a place where I hope to, in the next few years, engage civil society and the university in this learning journey around what would bioregional regeneration mean on Mallorca. And I've been doing this for the last 10 years through the courses I do with Gaia Education, and through a number of documentaries we co-created here on Mallorca, and also through work as a consultant, bringing international companies to Mallorca to actually use Mallorca as a test field for bioregional development. So a few years ago, I did work with a company called that produces detergents to look at, could we create a closed biomaterial cycle to provide soaps and detergents for the local tourism industry and local people through waste streams on Mallorca. Again, always with view of starting conversations, starting learning communities, not necessarily with immediately coming up with a marketable product, because as we developed that project, we created human relationships, and we gave people a new way of thinking about closing the loops of local biomaterials that have since then spawned all sorts of projects. So yeah, that's just to get us started. I'll stop sharing. Hold on a sec. stop presenting. Here we are. And before we turn it over to questions and people's comments, if I'm really honest, what has been my experience working with the local university, it's been enormously frustrating because we've just bumped into complacency because people were at a point in their career where they couldn't be bothered to push another big project, or the fear of local government to sign on, like we almost secured 10 million funding from the outside, and then the local government didn't sign where they needed to sign, and you put lots of effort into something, it suddenly falls flat on its face. Those of you who work with institutions probably have been in those situations many times. But ultimately, the idea of a university was to bring all sorts of knowledge together and help people in place to learn, but also to create international global exchange of learning and knowledge, but always in a way of how does that knowledge generated elsewhere is it work meaningfully for us in this place. And for me, it would be just the logical role of universities in the transformation we are now called to do, to reinvent themselves, because I'm observing a process where universities are becoming irrelevant. They're too slow in creating new curricula. The whole certification process of curricula takes 3 or 4 years, which means that by the time people actually finish a master's course, it's 5 years old and it's already somewhat out of date. It also, we talk about knowledge transfer to society, but it becomes token projects. It's not really institutionalized in a way that it deeply serves the local society. And so it creates a kind of intellectual inequality, split culture where the university becomes more and more inward gazing. And I live this all the time where as a non-affiliated academic, just writing academic papers becomes far too time consuming for this practitioner knowledge to then be transferred into academia. So the very structures are too slow to enable truly transdisciplinary and transsector collaboration with civil society and local government. So for anybody who expected that I'm going to give answers and solutions, I haven't. This is the beginning of an inquiry that I've been on for at least 10 years. But there are wonderful people on this call, like Eduard Müller. I've just seen that Michael Shaw is on the call, an old friend who's been doing bioregional work both in Scotland and in India. I would really love some statements, and please go into some of your experiences with this. Maybe I can actually pass the word briefly to Eduard Müller, who's been working in this field for a very long time as well.
Thank you, Daniel. Sorry, I'm late to the call, so I'm not really sure what you've been talking about. I had another call already planned. But for the last things that you said, I fully agree that the university system is obsolete. It's been obsolete for a while. It's nothing new. And it's tied also together, at least in many other countries like Latin America, where you're dependent on government regulations that are even further behind. So, for example, when we launched about 25 years ago, the first global program to professionalize protected area management, the ministry sent it to the Association of Biologists, and they said, this is not biology. And they sent it to the Association of Administrators, and they said, this is not administration, this is biology. So they didn't approve the program because the graduates would not have an association to affiliate themselves to. So it's tied to all these different structures. And having launched a university 26 years ago to be able to do these alternative programs, it hasn't been easy also because most of the people that you recruit as professors are still within the horizon one, if you want to look at it like that. And the process that they have to go through to be able to move into creating innovative programs is a big process of unlearning. and that unlearning becomes very difficult because they're all in this, not all, many are still in silos. So how can you open your mind to be able to really do transdisciplinary approaches, which is what is required now? And how do you focus on bringing up the soft skills, which are the critical skills, and not focus on only the hard skills or the knowledge base? A lot of the university programs are still looking at knowledge base, and we're not preparing the next generation to face the challenges that are coming that we don't know which they're gonna be. We're still preparing people for the old problems. So it is a dynamic process, and the bioregional approach, going to the title of your meeting, that's what we try to do with the Regenerative Communities Network. Have a network of bioregions that are doing regeneration, and we have an academic global program which we're actually already starting to develop with Ubiquity, H3 Uni, and you know all these people. Mm-hmm. We actually had the first session on Friday to develop global programs for regeneration. They'll be online and have students from around the world participate and be able to choose which bioregion they actually want to go practice a regeneration in. Mm-hmm. And co-create solutions within the bioregions and between bioregions. So actually the learning process will be allowing the students and the participants, and these are all different ages, not only regular degree programs, to co-create solutions together. And that will be, I think, the learning process for the future.
Just briefly, could you say very briefly something about the regenerative entrepreneurship program that you ran, and how
it's still running? Yeah. This was the first experiment of really diving deeper into regenerative development. So what I did was I wrote to 35, including you, global renowned experts in regeneration, expecting 3 or 4 answers. And we ended up with over 50 speakers, including Kate Rayworth, John Fullerton. You came on twice, Alan Savory. Actually, I was really amazed at the enthusiasm that all these great people have come to offer this program. So we actually transitioned from the environmental aspects, the landscape, all the ecosystem stuff. Then we went into the social aspects. We went into the regenerative economic aspects.
You're breaking up a bit. Maybe we can put a link to the course in the.
Yeah. What I'll do is I'll move over to closer to the
just in the interest of time. There's two more people. Like I'm looking at who's on the call, and I would love to also give.
Go ahead. I'll put you the link.
So Pana is from calling in from India, and she's worked for the Indian School for Development Management and has recently moved out from there. And I would love to hear an Indian perspective on the significance of this kind of bioregional based learning, and where universities at in India with this, and would you see potential in universities become catalytic in driving bioregional regeneration? So Pana, are you there?
Yes, I am. Thanks, Daniel. I'm happy to be on this call because I think it's a very important discussion that we are having. In India, we've just had the launch of a new education policy. And there is a reference to interdisciplinary work and the need for community-based work, etc. However, just as you have encountered the problem of universities working in silos, we continue to have those issues. There is very little work really being done on regeneration. Whatever is being done is done by private organizations and small communities, rather than within the sort of established education system. So I think the new policy provides the opportunity. And so one of the things that we are trying to do at Rashtam is to see if by setting up a Center for Regenerative Development, we can push the discourse around this in India.
Wonderful. And before I give it back to Commons Talk and facilitating the Q&A, the two more people that I think would be wonderful to hear from. Jenny Anderson has set up a center in Sussex. Also, I believe, tried to reach out to the local universities to drive a process of bioregional regeneration there. And also, after Jenny, if Michael Shaw would like to talk about his decades of experience of supporting regional development, both in Scotland and in India, that would be wonderful. Jenny, over to you.
Hi, Daniel. Thanks. Really great to be on this call with so many brilliant people committed to this concept and idea. And I don't have great news to share, regretfully, in that, you know, after a period of 2 years working hard with my local economic partnership, with my local university, trying to join the dots in the silo departments, whether it's business, sustainable development, to at least get some experimentation in smaller modules looking at regenerative development that was supposed to be coming online in the curriculum for 2021. The shock to the system of COVID-19 has pushed the thinking backwards into a scarcity mentality that is simply focusing on financial, which is obviously necessary, financial viability, and shut down all new course development from early this spring. So I don't know how. I think we're going to have a period of allowing people to get through their shock response to, particularly universities in the UK are now enormously fiscally dependent on overseas students, and that's made a big hole in their budget. So they, for which they were completely underprepared. So I think we're certainly, as far as I'm concerned, I'm taking a small pause here at the moment, taking a step back and looking at how we can develop a more grassroots rather than academic approach, because I think it's going to take some time for the local university to really recover, unfortunately, sadly.
Yeah,
but
that seems to be the case everywhere. Micah, have you got something to share from your work in India and Scotland? Where's the unmute button?
He has to unmute himself.
Okay. Do you know where to unmute yourself? If you push the cursor down on the left, there's a little microphone icon. No. What a shame.
Right, can you hear me now?
Yeah, now, yeah, excellent.
Yeah.
All right, so I'm mainly working with Heriot-Watt University in Edinburgh. It's the Faculty of Geoscience and also Mathematics. So it's mainly around the application of artificial intelligence to various engineering issues. The work is all in India, mainly in Oroville, working, which is a large community of 3,500 people in Tamil Nadu, which is the south of India. And the projects we've been working on have been mainly around smart irrigation systems that are, you take into account the weather and the soil conditions and the crop and everything else. And then you control the amount of irrigation. You forecast what the plants will need tomorrow, and then you do that amount of irrigation. It's been very successful in reducing the amount of energy used in pumping water, the amount of water and electricity itself, because it's a huge proportion of India's electricity is used in pumping water, mainly for irrigation. So that's quite successful. And then we've now moved on to working with a bunch of air conditioners. So we're looking at how we can do dispatchable air conditioning so that we can have a much more steady application on the grid, and also we're again using weather forecasting and artificial intelligence to orchestrate these air conditioners. So you get a very sort of flat demand on the generator, reduce the net amount of energy, have better access to renewable energy within the grid system and that type of thing. And we're about to apply that same software and artificial intelligence to a whole bunch of heat pumps at Findhorn. Mm-hmm. So, you know, we've got about 45 heat pumps within the Findhorn in the park. So we're going to orchestrate some of these again to have the sort of benefits both for the generator and the distributor, and also, of course, for the whole net carbonization that is basically the driver behind all these programs.
That's probably Michael and I've been collaborating. Thank you, Michael. Michael and I've been collaborating for years while I was also living at Findhorn on bringing universities to the Findhorn Eco-Village to give students a more embodied, lived experience of what whole systems designed for sustainability at the community scale could actually be all about. So that people were able to see over 70 eco homes and a community-owned wind park on the horizon, and use a local currency and see a local electric car pool functioning, and see all the benefits of shared solidarity economy at the local and regional scale. And it was wonderfully successful. I actually helped with Harriet Watt to build a new master's program in sustainable community design, which unfortunately only ran for 3 years. And again, why it stopped running is a classical example of the dysfunctionalities of universities. The person who had helped me set up that master's from within the university was moved up because of being very good and successful. And another person who also had a master's that had not very many people on it was put in charge of both masters, and her immediate move was, oh, I can increase the amount of people on my master's course by putting these two master's courses together and canceling the Findhorn modules. And this is I'm sharing this because it's a kind of systemic example of these weird political and personal decisions that then drive what people are actually offered in terms of education. I mean, I did a bit of research today. There's actually the University of Idaho has a master's in bioregional resource management. I think that's the only one I'm aware of. But over to you, and let's facilitate Q&A, whoever wants to do that.
Yeah, thank you very much, Daniel, for a wonderful presentation and contribution of all that are here present. I see that Jerome Lewis is here, and he's from UCL University in London. Maybe you would like to add something, Jerome?
Yeah, sure. Well, thank you very much, Daniel, and lovely to hear and see so many people engaged in this really important work. While I'm a strong supporter of this approach, and I think, whenever you want to get cross-disciplinary collaborations going, you need to have a focus, and a bioregion and the range of different issues that raises for the populations and the different species that share that space offers an excellent opportunity. Now, I'm not going to defend universities in general, because I think they've got huge problems, and certainly the division of disciplines in their current structure has a whole history which is not necessary to discuss here, but has all sorts of implications for how certain voices are included and others are excluded, and so on. And within universities, there are individuals who make great efforts to overcome some of these divisions. I've certainly had the good fortune of coming across quite a few in my time. But at the same time, there's a lot of structural resistance because of the way funding's operated, but also the way that time is apportioned to academics. So, for instance, my job involves 30% of my time is for my research, 30% of my time is intended to be spent on administrative duties, and 40% is on teaching students. The realities of that differ greatly between academics and their particular actions. But just to say that, to suddenly we have an obligation, for instance, to teach, which is one of the primary objectives of a university, and that does take time if you do it well. It's not something that can just be dropped and ignored. It's something which requires consistent and careful attention. So when if academics jump out, and I should perhaps add that I've been jumping out since many decades now, and I run something called the Extreme Citizen Science Group, and we specialize in developing various tools to enable any community, regardless of literacy or prior education, to collect information, scientifically valid information about issues which are of concern to them. And so we've done an awful lot of work around the world on environmental justice issues, which tends to be some of the biggest issues facing local communities trying to maintain their particular biomes in good order. And along come loggers and various other people from these economic systems that you've been criticizing. But and quite rightly so. But the issue, I think, is that there's a certain, and I really do want to be clear. I encourage optimism, and we all have to hope, and we have to try, and we have to work, even if we do apply cynicism to our practice. But there's a certain sort of prefigurative process that you're encouraging to go on, and in a lot of the Occupy and the youth movements now in XR and so on, seeking to make another world possible, their focus is on prefiguration. And so creating autonomous spaces, often around protests or resistance to tree cutting is one particular one at the moment. The HS2 is cutting down a whole bunch of ancient woodlands in Britain. And in those spaces, they're able to reconstitute and reformulate and reorganize the way their relationships are structured and function. And that prefiguration is, that's what they describe this term as, this prefiguration enables people to experience that other world that could be possible. And these spaces are for them the sacred spaces where you not just experience the possibilities of those alternative ways of organizing and being together in response to something, but excuse me, but you also have the opportunity of educating people through their participation in those spaces of protest. And so that's, I thought that you're a bit heavy on universities, really, because people in universities do have a whole number of obligations which come from the structures of those things. What we do in UCL is we have something called public engagement, which is a very important thing that there's funds and support for. But UCL was created with that in mind, as I don't know if any of you, or if you're aware, but the idea behind UCL was to finally make university education available to non-Christians and non-males. Because up until that point, only men, Christian men, were allowed to get university education. So Mahatma Gandhi, for instance, was educated in law at UCL. And it was because he was able to get that education that he could become a lawyer. And there are all sorts of other significant individuals who've gone on to make change. So I think UCL is an unusual example. But I've been working now 10 years with this Extreme Citizen Science Group. We've worked in, I'm not sure how many countries, but many, many countries. But it doesn't follow a bioregional approach. It follows, an engagement with people who ask for our help, because we try and do this as a sort of reciprocal relationship, a decolonizing of research, if you like. So, while I think that what you're doing as a prefiguration is really important and is really vital, because it's the only logical way forward, and I really like your maps of river systems. But the idea that, say, UCL could in any sensible way take on a proper management of the Thames Valley river basin with its X millions of people is of course not the point of UCL. UCL is there to teach people. The government and the various institutions of government are there, but collaboration, I think, as you quite rightly point out, is central. So the point I wanted to make was scale. That when you're making these points about universities, we do need to bear in mind scale. So your choice of Mallorca is a very sensible choice, of course, because it's a scale at which you can monitor and properly really look at the prefigurative efforts you're making and see how well they're going. But trying to do that for the Thames Valley becomes a much more complex process, and that forces universities, which are often embedded in these very large multi-million people communities, somewhat more of a challenge to engage at the level you're discussing for, say, Mallorca. I don't think we should dismiss it, but I think there needs to be a lot more prefigurative work in establishing the modalities on which that sort of relationship can occur in order to make it effective. And so really, I guess my question is, how do we push this perverse economic system that's being increasingly managed by demagogues and polarized politics of, you know, social media algorithms, to start to put much more effort, funding, time, and make available the sorts of resources required? And those resources are diverse, of course. It's not just money. It's about getting people together and having spaces for that to happen, and so on, as you have pointed out. How do we shift that at that larger level, move from these sort of local, you know, small set scale bioregional approaches to push this up into these much larger scale, which requires much greater commitment from a whole bunch of other agencies, not just the universities, you know, governments and so on, and their arms. Sorry, that was a very long question. I apologize.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of things to pick up on. Like, I don't want to have sounded heavy on the people in universities. If I sounded heavy on universities, I think that was somewhat intended. But I know that there are wonderful people in universities doing wonderful work. And for me, it's this, what you call prefigurative, this in my book I call it living the questions together, to start from the questions rather than the answers, and begin the process of really enabling not just university students but society at large to understand their place and their region better. And so that wouldn't mean that the university, UCL, has to run the Thames Valley, but it could be the key place in a network of collaboration that enables local entrepreneurs and local citizens groups to go deeper into this journey by giving them the academic back office that helps them access European funding, or well, in your case, you're not going to get so much of that anymore because you decided not to be part of the club. But the potential of universities to really turn the power of the lens that each discipline and its wealth of knowledge generated offers towards the specificity of the local region can create an ability of learning, and also a crucially important need for integration, because we need to have this multifaceted understanding of place and our regions in order to deal with the complexity that is in managing an entire river system region. And yeah, I sense that simply creating platforms of communication that allow people in place to access the wealth that the university actually holds about that region, but that is buried in the data files of, like, and again, of course, I'm completely owing up to the fact that my somewhat frustration is based on my own experience and the universities I encountered. But I've tried to do projects where I brought funding to the universities, and then people sat on their GIS data sets because it was their data. It was generated by public, like, taxpayer paid money, and they wouldn't open the data sets to do vital work for the future of the island that they were living on, just because they thought that, well, one day I might want to analyze that data. And it's those kinds of dysfunctionalities that make me be a bit hard on universities. But the whole invitation to this conversation is that I think they have a vital role, but we do need to transform them for our sake and for their sake. Yeah, but thanks.
Yeah, I mean, there is a huge effort now to decolonize universities, and I think that that's going to have ramifications that you should, or, you know, people seeking these bioregional approaches really need to take advantage of. There is a huge sort of stretching, squeezing, pushing, pulling going on, which they're the good times to get involved, the good times to, so don't give up.
Right.
Thank you, Jerome. Is there, Jonathan, you had a comment or a question? Chadwick?
Yes, I'm so happy to be here, so happy to see all the people and to imagine all the skills and intelligence that's been brought together by this wonderful forum. So I'm very grateful to be here. I live in Holloway in North London, and the issue of bioregionality really does have a problematic kind of relationship to where I live and where I perceive I live. I am a strange creature in the sense that I'm a sort of transdisciplinary object. I'm a theatre director and theatre producer and writer for most of my life, but due to shocks that I won't describe, I then set out to become a Master of Science in Ecological Economics. So I'm now a kind of odd schizophrenic, and but I also realized as I transgressed that major barrier in our culture between artistic work and scientific work, that I was going through one of the major problems of the university system and the whole intellectual and cultural system that we live in, which is this deep separation in the human being that it actually installs. And I feel really strongly two things. One is that really for universities to be really universities, I mean, it's a complete misnomer, and they should be really prosecuted under the Trade Description Act, because they're not universities at all. They're in fact quite the opposite. They divide things up and divide people up and divide themselves from the communities in which they're situated, and therefore I think that something very profound has got to happen within the understanding of knowledge in our societies, so that we no longer think of this idea that you know things by going away into this other world where you examine the world that you've come from, and that we know now that knowledge from quantum physics is a material process, and that the relationship between the knower and the known is something that's integral. And I really do feel very sympathetic to the people that have made comments about the relationship of patriarchy to the university system. Why do we call it masters? I actually, speaking from the outside, find all the nomenclature of the university quite distant and quite actually really quite obscurantist, and prevents one from actually knowing anything. So that's one thing that I think that one ought to be starting with, is to think we live in and act out a philosophy that we haven't determined and can't question because it's sort of invisible. The universities are permeated by the commercial culture around them. They have become modeled along the lines of businesses, and you've only got to speak to the students that are currently in occupation at Manchester University to actually look at what their demands are and to understand what it actually means to study in a university in this very specific circumstance of coronavirus. So I think profoundly looking at the issue of knowledge is better than perhaps looking in the first instance at bioregion, but I think that might be a question to be asked. And then, yes, this question of bioregion. I mean, looking at Holloway, which is a part of London, you know, I've always found it, looking at the ecological economic discipline, which I'd been trained in more recently, only a few years ago, I graduated as a Master of Science. I realized that there was problems with the boundary of where I live and the place that I live in. Where do we talk? Where can we talk about this boundary? I mean, this is a thoroughgoing problem in looking at ecosystems and looking at the relationship between ecosystems and larger bioregions. So that's the other question that I would bring to bear in the conversation. But I'm very grateful to be able to talk in this.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, because you really highlighted two issues that are very worth highlighting. One of them is this reintegration into place, like the sort of part of the scientific revolution and the evolution of technology and knowledge and science was very closely linked to this Cartesian split of that you spoke to, this false idea that the observer and the observed are somehow separate, that objective observation is even possible, that by basically not paying attention to the observing subject. And of course, many disciplines within universities have evolved beyond that and have tried to make that the subject of their study. But for me, part of the bioregional agenda, and certainly since the 1970s in the US, when this idea found a new expression, is this concept of re-inhabitation, of coming back home to place. And that's not just re-inhabitation of how do we fit human beings into this place without destroying it, but it's actually much deeper than that. It's healing that false dualism to understand the human beings in that place as expressions of that place. It's like in the journey of human knowledge acquisition, we very often have thrown out the baby with the bathwater when we did one of those also famous paradigm shifts. The whole framing of paradigm shift predisposes us to create a thinking that we're going from this to that. And in that thinking, we often dismiss the from because it had built up too many issues and too many problems. And by the time we finally managed to shift, we then want to go to the other extreme instead of saying what's still worth keeping of the old. And again, in the beginning of the scientific and academic enterprise, we started to dismiss age-old knowledge of how to live in place that indigenous people held all over the world as primitive knowledge, quote unquote. And I think that was one of the biggest mistakes that we made as a species. I think that's why we've created a global system that disconnected our ways of meeting our needs and economic needs from these real biophysical patterns of scale linking, health generating processes that nature runs on the rest of nature, because it's so ingrained that even just talking about nature, we create another rather than include ourselves in it. So thank you for highlighting that piece. And now I'm missing what your second piece was, which was equally important. Can you just remind me briefly?
I'm not myself absolutely sure of what it was, because as I was speaking, I got totally confused about what I was saying. But the only 2 points that I was really making was the character of knowledge and what actually we're talking about when we're talking about what actually unifies the university, and trying to think through what is the underlying philosophy now and how really all the disciplines need to pay attention to the question, I think, possibly, although it sounds rather grand, of what it is that is the philosophy. Because philosophy, if you look at the pre-existing university, I think philosophy played a very important part in the construction of the curriculum. And it's interesting to look back on that as well. And I agree with you about this business of moving from one paradigm to another, but certainly the issue of knowledge. And I think what I remember an indigenous thinker who'd been through the university system in South America called engaging in epistemological rebellion. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really quite an important thing to think about.
Thanks. Again, there's like one of the core, I briefly mentioned Gaia Education, and I think one of the big real innovations that they did when they launched their curriculum in 2005 is that they invited people from a classical three-dimensional approach to designing for sustainability, the often called the columns of sustainability, the social column, the economic column, and the ecological column. And it's a very rigid kind of metaphor. And by putting it into a circle, into a mandala that included worldview, and basically invited people to say, as we find solution pathways in social, ecological, and economic areas, the way we see our world, the narrative we have about who we are and what knowledge counts, what knowledge doesn't count, what's the point of, like, how do we define success, that the current economic, monetary success-driven model that still measures success in gross domestic product, which very clearly goes up when catastrophes happen. All of that is a deep reframe. Like only if we reframe our worldview and value system can we find a deeper approach to sustainability, and that's partially the discourse that universities should encourage, but really they've become voice boxes of neoliberal dogmatism too often. Not all of them, and not every teacher by far, but too often that's what they're doing. We've got another 10-15 minutes maximum. Who else?
I see that Eliona and Edward have raised their hands, so
Maybe go for Ilona first.
yeah, Eliona, you want to go first?
There we go. Is it working? Or should we go to Edward and then go to...
Okay, Edward, then Edward.
Yeah, thank you. I think we have to look at the root of the problem. The university system today is built on the reductionist approach. If you want to make a career at a famous university, you have to do a one-track, narrow, focused thing to be able to get to the peer-reviewed journals. And the whole ranking system is based on the number of publications. So it's all tied together, and it's not structured to allow for interdisciplinary and holistic approaches, which are, especially when you have to bring in things like spirituality. I mean, we cannot move forward without incorporating spirituality. And when I talk with other university presidents about spirituality, they look at me like, what did this guy smoke this morning? And so it is that on one side, and the other important component is scientists. This is the best planetary documented scientific extinction. I mean, we're in a planetary extinction with all the science behind it. And I just resigned on Friday from the Scientific Council for Climate Change for my country because I could not take it anymore. The reductionist approach of these scientists is exactly what's taking us to this process. One of them came up again, that the two hurricanes that we had in 10 days apart that destroyed Central America twice were not related to climate change. It was climate variability. There was no statistical significance in the 99 point. So their bias on using statistics, and many times it's wrong statistics, to decide or not on knowledge and information is totally wrong. And that is a habit. When I studied in my PhD in Germany, my professors used to say, use your common sense first and then go to support yourself on the statistics. Science today has become exclusively statistics and mostly with wrong models evaluating. So we're forgetting the last stage. We're generating more data than in all previous years before every single year. Some of it goes to information, some of it goes to knowledge. We forgot the last stage, which is wisdom. We're not transforming that into wisdom. And wisdom requires you to move away from basically statistical models to actually think the process. And that is missing at the university level. And that's the reason why we cannot transition. So I don't really have faith in that most of these important universities are going to survive, because simply the students don't want to go there. They want to be prepared to build their own future. And no university is teaching kids how to build their future.
Yeah.
Even the UN system, the climate change system, the GIZ, all these agencies are talking about adaptation. Yeah, we have to learn to adapt. I don't have to learn to adapt to a collapsing planet. We still have time to build the future we want. We still have time to regenerate the planet we want. Why should we be learning to adapt to a collapsing planet? So it's mindsets. We really have to move away from all this system, and that's going to be hard.
Well, I mean, what is happening is, for example, Joe Brewer creating a learning community of people wanting to explore what does bioregional regeneration or ecosystems regeneration mean, or then the network that grew up around the ecosystems restoration camp or David Hodgson doing the Global Regeneration Collab, bringing people together as peer learning groups. So basically, we're finding people who are already called to do this work, finding other ways to find their knowledge than academic degrees. But it would be wonderful if the universities also started, and it can be just a few pioneering ones or new ones that started to explore what the role of universities is in this, because I think it would be tragic if we throw out the baby with the bathwater with the universities. We need universities. We need their knowledge base. We need the rigor of the scientific disciplines, but we need to put them into context, and we need to know what tool to apply when. And as you say, absolutely, there's a much deeper cultural interchange, including conversations around meaning and purpose and spirituality, that needs to be brought into the universities. But again, the universities could be a forum where this can happen in a way that stays within a culture of discourse that allows for intersubjective consensus, which is really what science is all about. It's an intersubjective consensus-making activity. And yeah, Ilona, did you manage to get your mic going?
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me now? Great. Thank you so much. Everything was so interesting. And actually, I'm glad that I get to follow on from Edward Mueller, because what you said about spirituality was exactly what I had wanted to say, although in a roundabout way, because your diagrams in your talk, Daniel, were very interesting to me, because they are diagrams that occur and recur in spiritual systems. And there is ultimately the question, you put many different things in the center, from the solidarity economy, place, the individual, and other things. But the essential issue is the human being in relation to God in that center has always been the theological discussion. And when philosophy, like a philosopher like Foucault, he describes analogy as this figure of the center and the perimeter and the radiating lines that join them. And then he starts talking about the 16th century to 20th century, but that figure and the epistemes that follow, and all the problems and issues, which basically are what we're now dealing with in our point in time. But that figure is, of course, a much more ancient, millennia old perhaps, figure in which, Foucault says man is in the center. Earlier times may say human is in the center. Then God is in the center. So what is essential for us, as Edward says, is this, our spirituality. To what extent are we making ourselves God in the center? Or to what extent are we having a relationship with the creator of this universe? And to what extent are we able to then divest ourselves of our accumulated preconceptions of the way the world is? And how do we set up a mystagogic path within any type of learning? I personally believe we are sorely lacking in praxis, in mystagogy or initiatory, or a method of doing things that is spiritual in praxis in our Western civilization. We have become very heavy on logos, very heavy on philosophy, words, thinking. But what is valuable about doing in relation to philosophy and thinking is that doing also will surpass the thinking mind. So it will help the two to work together. And I do feel this is what's needed. And it is so difficult to raise the issue of spirituality in university, as Edward says, or in society in general. It has to be done in a way that, who knows, perhaps someone else can have a suggestion on that.
I mean, it's precisely because words like spirituality or even the word God can bring up all sorts of reactions in people, and for some people even they stop listening when those names are words are named. But ultimately, to my mind, it is about right relationship, and it is about understanding our role in an as place, which again would be the ancient indigenous traditions all agree that the land does not belong to us, we belong to the land. And that is, it sounds like a simple statement, but it's profound. If we begin to live again from that understanding that we are expressions of place and that we are actually expressions of nature and therefore not separate from her, that this nested complexity is continuously evolving. And some people in the past and in the present prefer to refer to it as God, and others find other ways of relating to this unifying dynamic unity that brings us forth, and in which we also have creative agency. And it's, I think, all the wisdom traditions that speak of eternal life speak of life being eternal, not of skin encapsulated egos being eternal. And if we find ways to reconnect to that, like people have tried, Father Thomas Berry and Brian Swim have brought in the magnificence of the scientific story of the universe and the evolution of life on Earth into a story that people can also emotionally and on a deeper resonant level connect with, but through the power of science, fall in love and re-enchant the universe again.
Of course. Yeah.
Yeah. So
I agree with
just
the
one
power of science.
briefly before you come back. The one more thing that I wanted to highlight was because you said initiatory processes. I think they're absolutely vitally important. I feel like because we haven't, again, when we dismissed so-called primitive cultures, we lost many of the practices of people initiating into mature membership in the community of life and into mature membership into their communities. And really what the results of our actions are now pushing us to, with mass extinction and climate change and all this, is a species level rite of passage. We are now in that space of not knowing whether we're going to make it. We put ourselves into that space, and that is beginning to start a personal transformation and waking up process that also takes us closer to that relationship between the intimate and the ultimate, which to me is what spirituality and the conversation around God is about. But God as a father figure is one thing. God as a as an expression of this dynamic process, nurturing life and life's capacity to create conditions conducive to life, is maybe a more scientific way of expressing the same thing. I'm aware that we're sort of 90 minutes into this.
No,
you want to run a 5 minute thing, or?
There are 3 hands raised, Daniel. So shall we do first Michael Gordon?
Let's keep it relatively short, because I have a commitment that, like, basically I have to keep it to another 5 minutes.
Okay.
So if the questions are short, they can also just be statements.
Yeah. Okay. Who want to take it? Michael Gordon or Stephen Henton or Alessandro Camis?
I'm Steve. I can be quick.
Okay. Hi, Steve.
Hi. At the University of Yavle, we've managed to get a government assignment to work with what they call is the circular economy. And I just want to say that the game has changed. I'm talking to people in government and local authority with my university hat on, and I'm not meeting people who are looking at me saying, hey, I know how to do stuff, you are just a bloody academic. I'm meeting people who are saying, oh my God, we've got this issue here that we have to fulfill, and this is a question of materiality. You must understand the materiality in this. You and I, we're responsible for our local bioregion, but so are local authorities. They are material to this, and so is government. And it's not academic, it's real. And when we've been talking to them, they've really all generally are concerned that they have to do something, and it's in their job to do it, and they want universities to help because they want the academic knowledge. So I think we're seeing the landscape completely changing, and we're looking at setting up a learning center where we can use citizen science and the rest of it to really help the university. But the only way we're doing it is by creating a network of trust, and that's taking a bit of time, and I'll stop there.
Very briefly on this, as an example, where Stephen and I have a shared friend here on Mallorca called Christa Soderberg, who set up an organization called Circle Carbon that is promoting the use of biochar in regenerative agriculture and as a way of carbon drawdown. And just recently I had a conversation with him where he basically asked, do you know anybody in the university that could do a study on, like a controlled study on a number of plots that we apply our activated biochar to show how amazingly it works, but with the scientific data behind it. We can show the before-after pictures and they're convincing to most people, but we would like to do the science. And as we had this conversation, again, this slight dysfunctionality of the academic system came in. Why is it so difficult to make that request to a university? And not like, why is it not much easier to find a master's or an undergraduate final thesis student to just spend a month or 6 months working with Christa and Circle Carbon on creating such a study? It tends to, when you engage in this process with universities, it becomes a 2-year energy drawing, paperwork producing, frustrating thing, and in the end the student comes and does something that you didn't want him to do because the professor wanted him to do something else. And yeah, anyway, I'll get off my frustration once again. 2 more quick questions. Let's keep them quick.
Michael or Alessandro?
Yeah, I got a few comments. So listening to all those examples that you mentioned where the university is not able to follow the processes because it's slow, because they're looking at other priorities. I mean, it seems to me that they're all driven by profit. All those examples. Basically, following the past 20 years, the university system in the UK, but not only in the UK, has been affected by the American model, which is a private system based on profit. So, which includes the peer review, the rankings, but also the choices on how to assign resources to different courses, different fields of research, and so on and forth. Therefore, universities are not looking, they're not interested in what you're proposing because they're looking for money, and usually they don't find the money they're looking for, and they're going down. The other comment, so probably, looking back into the older public university system we had in Europe, at least, and eventually even earlier than that, to the origin of the university. That's my other comment. So listening to some of the comments, it seems like university is an invention of the age of the Enlightenment, based on universality and the truth, but it's not true. University is a medieval invention. The word itself, universitas, is a Latin word, which basically means literally all those who. And it was used in the Latin language, but it became in use with this meaning in the 10th century when the guilds, so the English equivalent is guild, an organization of all those who are doing carpentry, all those who are doing shoemakers, and all those who are teaching law. Universitas Studiorum, the University of the Studies, not the studies, those who study, the studies of law, the firms of law, we would say today. So probably now, we are now a university. This group of people discussing is all those who look into the bioregional issue. And my final remark is about what is happening right now in this very moment in the last year, so hence the pandemic, since what's going to happen in the next years to our territory. I think there is a very strong dynamic going on. I'm going to just mention 3 things to give you the idea. Last week, 10 days ago, I think, they locked down Paris, and it seems like 300,000 people moved out of the metropolitan area. In London, the prices of the small apartments are dropping dramatically, because people are leaving. Those owners or renters of the small houses tend to move out to the small villages, leave the metropolitan area. In Italy, when there was a lockdown in April, 30,000 people in one night moved out of Milano, going back to their villages in the south. So we have these dynamics, and eventually nobody's looking at what is happening, and nobody is planning on this. Because when you have a dynamic, planning is essential in general, always. But when things are changing, it is much more necessary, because the risk of dropping down, the first slide you have shown the resilience, regenerating resilience of the one going down. If you don't plan ahead, you're going to go down. In this time of crisis, which has lasted, 9 months now, and it's probably going to last twice as much, if not more, if we don't do any planning. So planning applies to the territory, the landscape, the water resources, the energy, the economy, the education, you name it, everything. And nobody's doing any fucking planning. I beg your pardon, guys. So that's the point. And I think, what I teach every day is urban morphology, which is based on a multi-scalar approach. When one scale or viewpoint is the territory, one is the city, one is the urban tissue, one is the building. So I'm with you guys. I'm listening.
Alessandro, what wonderful. I feel awkward I personally have to go, but I don't want to cut this off. So if you guys want to have a continued conversation, please let me not be the one stopping it. But I want to just highlight one thing that Alessandro said. It reminded me of the ancient Chinese proverb: if you don't change where you're heading, if you don't change what you're doing, you might end up where you're heading. And we're right now with this pandemic and with a series of converging crises have an opportunity to turn this crisis into redesigning the human presence on Earth. There's a huge potential in that. It's a potential that will give us more meaning, healthier lives, and will give our children a future. But we have to engage everybody in this process now. And I hope that universities take a role in that. And I'm excited that the card-carrying academics took their time on a Saturday to join this call, because that's what gives me hope that we can still do that. So thank you very much for this wonderful conversation. And I'm just going to leave, but please have a conversation. Don't let me stop you.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.